She only wanted to deliver flowers before school. Then she looked up and saw a sniper aiming straight at Korea's most powerful billionaire. 11-year-old Amara froze as two fake hotel workers opened a rifle case on the rooftop above Aurora Palace, and suddenly her little sisters realized nobody else had noticed the trap. Security kept smiling, cameras kept flashing, and billionaire Han Min-jae walked directly toward the kill zone without a clue he was seconds from dying. So the girls did the impossible. They grabbed the billionaire in front of live cameras and forced him off his path just as the gunshot exploded through the crowd. Panic ripped through the hotel entrance. People started screaming, and Min-jae turned to the terrified sisters, realizing one horrifying thing. Somebody inside his own company wanted him dead. But what none of them knew was that saving his life had just painted targets on all three girls. Welcome to Wonderpath Stories, besties. Please like, share, and subscribe. The rain came first. Heavy, relentless, the kind soul saves for days when something is about to change forever. Amara pulled her flower basket tighter against her chest, weaving through the morning crowd with Nyla on her left and Zuri pressed close to her right. The Aurora Palace Hotel blazed gold through the gray sky ahead of them, its entrance swarming with cameras, reporters, and enough security to protect a small country. Amara had lived in Itaewon long enough to know when something important was happening. This felt bigger than important. This felt like history. Maybe the rich people tip today, Nyla said, craning her neck above the crowd. She was the boldest of the three, always had been, the one who spoke before she thought and somehow said exactly the right thing anyway. Zuri tugged the hem of Amara's sleeve and said nothing. She rarely needed words. Where Nyla was fire, Zuri was water. She felt things before they happened, sensed shifts in the air the way other people sensed weather. Amara was looking up at the hotel facade when she noticed the rooftop access door. It wasn't the door itself that bothered her. It was the badge on the man walking through it. She'd seen enough delivery workers, enough hotel staff in 4 years of making rounds through this neighborhood to know that maintenance crews wore blue lanyards. The man disappearing through that door wore white. And the second man behind him was carrying something long and narrow wrapped inside a canvas bag that sat wrong against his shoulder, too heavy for tools, too careful for luggage. Nyla, Amara said quietly. See him, Zuri whispered before anyone else spoke. The motorcade turned onto the boulevard below. Everything happened in the span of about 40 seconds. The three sisters pushed through the crowd, Nyla going low while Amara went wide, Zuri running straight down the center. Security guards were looking outward, not inward. Nobody was watching three small African girls weaving through a crowd of journalists like water finding cracks in stone. The billionaire stepped out of his black car in a charcoal suit, calm-faced, already reaching to button his jacket, already performing the kind of composed authority that powerful men wear like a second skin. He didn't see them coming. Amara grabbed his right arm first. Keep walking, mister, she said, breathless, urgent, her basket of sunflowers swinging wildly. Don't stop moving. He looked down at her, startled, irritated. One of his bodyguards reached for her shoulder. Nyla ducked under the guard's arm and grabbed the billionaire's left hand, pulling hard in the opposite direction from the path his team had choreographed. There was a fraction of a second where the world balanced on a needle's edge, where security training fought against the absurdity of three children refusing to let go. Then the gunshot cracked, not loud, suppressed, but the marble pillar 2 feet to the right of where Han Min-jae had been standing shattered in an explosion of white dust and stone, and the sound that followed wasn't the gunshot at all. It was 300 people screaming at once. The crowd became a wave. Security went from formation to chaos in seconds, bodies moving in every direction, hands reaching, radios screaming. Amara felt someone's elbow connect with the side of her head. She stumbled. Min-jae caught her. She looked up at him, ears ringing, heart slamming. He was looking at the shattered pillar. Then he looked at her. His jaw was tight. His eyes were doing something she'd never seen a grown man's eyes do. They were calculating, furious, and frightened all at once, a combination she didn't have a word for. His security team closed around him like water around a stone. Someone was shouting about the rooftop. Someone else was already on the phone. But before they pulled him away, Min-jae looked down at Amara one more time. You knew, he said. It wasn't a question. The next day, the whole country knew their faces. Every news channel in Korea ran the clip on loop. 3 little sisters in school uniforms and flower baskets grabbing a billionaire by the arms, and dragging him out of a kill zone on live camera. Nyla had already decided this was the best thing that had ever happened to them. Zuri cried for an hour after they got home and then ate 2 bowls of rice and felt better. Amara couldn't sleep. She kept seeing the white lanyard, kept thinking about the second man she never got a good look at, kept wondering if they'd gotten both of them off that roof. Their guardian, Selene Akhafer, found out from the neighbor who knocked on their door at 6 in the morning holding a phone showing the video. Selene was 23 years old and already running on 3 hours of sleep after a hospital night shift, and she stood there in her scrubs watching her girls go viral with the specific expression of a woman deciding between screaming and praying. She chose prayer. She made tea. She sat the 3 of them down. "We just moved him a little," Nyla said. "We didn't do anything crazy." "Someone shot a marble pillar, Nyla." "It was the pillar, not the man." Selene looked at Amara, who was the one she always looked at when she needed the truth. Amara nodded slowly. "We're fine, we promise." Selene exhaled. She pulled all 3 of them into her arms at once, her grip so tight none of them could breathe, and she held them like that for a long time without saying anything. 3 days later, a black car appeared outside their building. It was not the first time someone had come by after the news coverage. Reporters had tried twice. A TV producer left a card. A woman from some foundation called twice about scholarship opportunities. Selene had handled all of it efficiently, politely, and with the particular warmth of someone who has learned to keep powerful people at arm's length without making them feel dismissed. But this car was different. No crew, no cameras. Just a driver who stepped out first, then held the door. Han Min-jae stepped out alone. He was 25 years old, which was younger than he looked in press photographs, and in person he was somehow both more and less than the image. Less imposing than his reputation suggested. More still. He stood on the narrow Itaewon street in the kind of quiet that felt deliberate, like a man who had learned long ago that stillness was power. Brown hair cut close, brown eyes that took in everything and gave back nothing. He wore no tie. He had his hands in his pockets. He looked slightly lost, which was the strangest thing Selene had ever seen on a face like that. She opened the door before he knocked. He blinked. "You knew I was coming." Zuri said someone important was going to visit today. She stepped aside. "The girls are in the kitchen." Apartment was small, warm. Music was playing from a little Bluetooth speaker on the windowsill, something Nigerian, full of brass and rhythm. Shoes were piled by the entrance in a beautiful, chaotic heap. Something smelled like ginger and sweet potato and frying plantain. Min-jae stepped inside and stopped in the hallway, and for a moment he didn't move. Just stood there breathing it all in like a man who'd forgotten what a home smelled like. Then Nyla's voice came from the kitchen. "Is he actually here? Does he have food?" "If he's showing up without food, he can go back." Min-jae almost smiled. Almost. He stayed for 3 hours. He hadn't planned to stay for 3 hours. He'd planned to thank them, perhaps make a discreet offer to help with school fees or some other financial gesture that wouldn't feel transactional, and leave within 20 minutes. Instead, Nyla put a bowl of instant noodles in front of him and dared him with her eyes to say anything about it. He ate the whole bowl. Zuri showed him a drawing she'd made of the hotel that day, detailed and slightly terrifying in how accurately it captured the angle of the shot. Amara sat across from him and asked, in a voice that was entirely too calm for an 11-year-old, whether he'd identified the 2 men from the roof. He looked at her for a long moment. "We got one, the other is still missing." She nodded, unsurprised. "He had a white lanyard, that's how I knew they weren't real workers." Min-jae was quiet. "You noticed that?" "I notice things." He looked at Selene, who was washing dishes and pretending not to listen. Then he looked back at Amara. He had been in rooms with government officials, with corporate strategists, with intelligence consultants, with people whose entire careers were built on reading environments quickly. And this 11-year-old girl in a school uniform had clocked a detail his own security team had missed. "Thank you," he said. It came out rougher than he intended. Amara shrugged like she saved billionaires every other Tuesday. "You're welcome." He came back the following week, then the week after that. He told himself the first return was security-related. He needed to understand the girls' exposure risk since they'd been on every news channel in Korea. He told himself the second return was courtesy. He stopped telling himself stories after the 3rd visit, when he showed up with groceries because he'd overheard Selene tell a neighbor she hadn't had time to shop, and he stood in their kitchen for 40 minutes helping Nyla figure out why her egg soup kept going wrong. He had never cooked a meal in his life. It turned out he had an instinct for it, Selene watched him from across the kitchen with the careful, measured expression of a woman who'd learned to distrust generosity. She had good reasons for that. Her ex, Marcus, had been generous too in the beginning: flowers, time, attention. And then bit by bit that generosity had curdled into something else entirely. Selene was not the kind of woman who forgot lessons she'd paid for with her own pain. But something about the way Min-jae moved in the chaos of their apartment was difficult to categorize as a performance. He didn't look like a man trying to impress anyone. He looked like a man who had wandered into warmth by accident and didn't quite know what to do with it. He fixed the hinge on the cafe door that had been wobbling for 6 weeks. He brought reference books for Amara's history project without being asked, having apparently remembered a specific detail she'd mentioned in passing. He sat through an entire 90-minute school presentation about West African textile traditions that Zuri gave to the three of them as an audience practice run, and he asked actual questions afterward. Selene did not trust it, but she was watching it. Every single day, she was watching it very carefully. 2 weeks later, the quiet ended. Marcus came on a Thursday night when the street was still wet from afternoon rain and the cafe was closed. Selene heard him before she saw him, the particular cadence of his voice raised above its normal register, the quality of anger in it that she had learned over 2 years to identify the way animals learn to identify predators by sound. She moved to the girls first, got them upstairs, got the door locked, told them to stay quiet, and she said it in the voice she only used when she meant it absolutely, and even Nyla didn't argue. Then she went back down. Marcus was on the street below the window, drunk and loudly performing a version of grief that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with rage dressed in romantic language. He owed money to people who were not patient. He needed cash. He needed her to be reasonable. He needed her to understand that she was being selfish, that she was making things harder than they needed to be, that they could just talk about this like adults if she would open the door. She didn't open the door. She had her phone in her hand. She was trying to decide who to call. The police, experience told her, were unpredictable. She had called them twice during the relationship and learned quickly that the system was not built for people in her situation. A neighbor had already stuck his head out and then retreated when Marcus's voice climbed. Selene was calculating her options with the practiced efficiency of a nurse managing an emergency when the black car turned the corner. She hadn't called him. She hadn't even thought of him. But Min-jae stepped out of that car like he'd been watching, like he knew, like he had specifically arranged himself to be somewhere nearby in case something like this happened. Which, she would later learn, was exactly what he had done. He walked up to Marcus and he did not raise his voice. That was the part she never forgot. He spoke at complete, contained, freezing volume. He said Marcus's full name. He said it like he had read a file. He mentioned specific numbers, debt amounts, names of creditors, and then he mentioned certain transactions that should not have existed at all, and Marcus's face went from aggressive to pale in the span of about 4 sentences. Min-jae made a single call. Within 12 minutes, 2 police cars arrived. The officers knew Marcus by name. Marcus was gone in 20 minutes. Screaming backwards, promising consequences, but gone. Selene came downstairs and stood in the empty street. The rain had started again. Min-jae stood a few feet away, still as always, hands in his pockets, looking at the place where the police car had turned out of sight. He didn't look at her. He looked like a man giving her space to process something enormous on her own terms. "You were watching us," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Yes." "How long?" "Since the day after the hotel." She should have been angrier than she was. She knew that. She folded her arms across her chest and looked at the rain and tried to locate the anger but kept finding something else in its place. Something complicated and warm and terrifying. "You could have told me." "You wouldn't have allowed it." She turned to look at him. He was looking at her now. His face was doing the thing it sometimes did when the girls said something unexpected, this unguarded, unperformed softness that sat completely wrong on a face that powerful. Like it had forgotten its armor for just a moment. "No," she admitted. "I wouldn't have." He nodded, looked away. "Get some sleep. I'll have someone at the end of the street tonight." He got back in the car. She stood in the rain and watched the car leave, and then she went upstairs and sat in her kitchen for a long time with her hands around a cup of tea that went cold before she drank it. The following morning, Zuri announced at breakfast that she thought Mr. Han was in love with Selene. Nyla immediately demanded evidence. Zuri pointed out the groceries he kept bringing, the way he fixed things without being asked. The way he looked at Selene when Selene wasn't looking. That's not evidence, Nyla said. That's just vibes. Vibes count, Zuri said serenely. Selene, who was standing approximately 3 feet away making tea, said nothing. Her ears were a spectacular shade of warm. She pretended very hard to be interested in the kettle. A few days later, everything shifted again. One of Min-jae's security analysts brought information he wished he could unreceive. The missing man from the Aurora Palace rooftop had been identified. He was a former corporate intelligence officer with documented ties to Duyun, the uncle Min-jae had been expecting trouble from for years. The assassination had been internal family betrayal disguised as corporate strategy. And the security team's investigation had caught something else in the surveillance footage. Duyun's people had run a background check on Selene and the girls the same week of the hotel incident. They were being watched. Min-jae made the decision quickly. He drove to the cafe himself and told Selene without softening it. She listened with her arms crossed and her face still, and her eyes doing the rapid internal calculation he'd come to recognize as her processing something she didn't want to process. When he finished, the apartment was quiet. How serious is the threat? She asked. Serious enough that I won't pretend it isn't. She looked at the girls across the room, Nyla doing homework with aggressive confidence, Zuri drawing, Amara reading with the focused intensity of someone twice her age. Selene's throat moved. What are you suggesting? I have a property outside the city. Countryside, it's secure. You'd have full privacy, your own space. I wouldn't, he paused. Something shifted in his expression. I wouldn't impose myself. You're already imposing yourself, she said, but the heat was gone from it, just fact. And you know that. He held her gaze. I know. She looked at the girls again. She closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. When she opened them, she had made her decision. 2 weeks, if it's safe by then, we come back. It was not 2 weeks. It was longer. The countryside estate sat in a bowl of hills south of Seoul, surrounded by trees that had been growing longer than most people's memories. It was not minimalist the way Min-jae's penthouse was minimalist. It had been decorated by someone who actually lived in it once, with warm rugs and deep sofas, and a kitchen big enough to cook in properly. The girls colonized every surface within 48 hours. Zuri's drawings appeared on the refrigerator. Nyla took over the living room for dancing practice. Amara found the library and essentially moved in. Min-jae came in the evenings. He told himself it was to review security updates. He was not convincing himself of this anymore. What happened over the following weeks was quiet and slow and enormously consequential. He learned how to make jollof rice from Selene's instructions and burned it twice and got it approximately right on the 3rd try. Selene learned that he took his coffee black and that he hated the sound of the television, but would sit through the girls' movie nights without a word because they were happy. He found out that she'd been pre-med before her sister died, and she'd switched to nursing because the training was shorter and the girls had needed her faster. She found out that his father had spent Min-jae's entire childhood communicating through silence. Punishment silence, disappointed silence, the particular cruelty of being watched and found permanently insufficient by someone who was supposed to love you unconditionally. He told her that on a night when the girls were asleep, and the kitchen light was the only one on, his elbows on the counter and his voice quieter than she'd ever heard it. She didn't offer him comfort immediately. She let the words exist in the room first. That was something she did that he couldn't name. She understood how grief needed space before it needed reassurance. I spent 20 years building something I thought would make him proud, he said. He died before I got close enough to find out if it worked. Selene was quiet for a moment. Do you think it would have? He considered it honestly. No, she nodded. Me neither. Then, after a pause, my parents weren't cruel like that. They were absent. Which is its own kind of thing. She looked at her hands. When my sister died and I had to raise 3 children at 20, I had nobody to call and say this is too much. I just had to decide it wasn't. He looked at her for a long time. How do you do that? Just decide something and become it. She shrugged one shoulder. You don't really have a choice. The girls need someone unbroken, so you become unbroken. You're not unbroken, he said gently. You're just very good at holding the pieces together while you walk. Her eyes went to the window. Something crossed her face, not pain exactly, more like recognition. Like someone had said out loud a thing she'd never let herself name. She didn't cry, but she pressed her lips together and breathed through her nose, and Min-jae sat there quietly and didn't look away. That evening happened at a lantern festival in the village below the estate. The girls had heard about it from the estate's housekeeper and deployed their most effective combined negotiation tactics: Amara's calm logic, Nyla's dramatic insistence, and Zuri's enormous silent eyes, until everyone agreed to go. They released lanterns at the river's edge, the orange light floating up into the dark in slow, wavering rises that reflected off the water below. Nyla was already trying to talk Zuri into racing their lanterns. Amara was watching the sky with the expression of someone cataloging information for future use. Min-jae was standing slightly behind Solani, close enough to be a presence, far enough to be deniable, and he was looking at the side of her face the way people look at things they're afraid of losing. She could feel it. She'd been able to feel it for weeks. She turned. He didn't look away. "Starring," she said. "I know. She should have made a joke." She was very good at making jokes when conversations got too close to the edge, but something about the lantern light and the sound of the water and the three girls laughing 30 feet away made the joke impossible to construct. "Min-jae, I don't want you to go back," he said. His voice was low and even and completely without performance. "Not because of the danger. Because every time you leave that kitchen in the morning, I have to talk myself out of following you. And I am not a man who follows people." His jaw was tight. "I follow nothing. I built an entire empire on being the person everyone else follows. And you," he stopped. "You have made that completely impossible." Selene looked at him for a long moment. "I'm not an easy person." "I know. I don't trust quickly. I probably trust too slowly. I'll push back on everything. I have 3 children that come with me everywhere, and they have opinions, and those opinions are loud." Nyla's opinions alone could fill a boardroom. Something cracked in her chest. She laughed, low and startled and real. He caught it. She saw the way his face opened up around it, the way he looked at her laugh like it was something he'd been cataloging and saving and would have protected at considerable personal cost. She stepped forward. She put her hand against his chest, feeling his heartbeat through his shirt. He went very still the way he always went still, deliberate, controlled, except his hand came up and covered hers. And for a moment, they just stood there in the lantern light with the girls somewhere in the distance, and the world suspended. And then Selene stood on her toes and kissed him. And he kissed her back like he'd been holding his breath for months and had finally remembered how to breathe. Neither of them noticed the camera flash from the tree line. 2 days later, Do-yeon made his move. It came through the media first, a financial corruption story tied to Murray Holdings, documents that seemed to implicate Min-jae in falsified contracts from 3 years prior. The story broke on every major outlet simultaneously, which meant it was coordinated, which meant someone had been sitting on it and waiting for exactly the right moment. Min-jae's stock dropped 11% before trading was paused. His board called an emergency meeting. His lawyers called 3 times before breakfast. Min-jae handled it with the cold, controlled focus he reserved for genuine crises. But this time, for the first time, he wasn't handling it alone. Selene found him in the estate study at 2 in the morning with documents spread across the desk and the particular stillness of a man containing something enormous. She didn't ask if he was okay. She made coffee and sat down across from him and said, "Tell me what you know," and he told her everything. Meanwhile, the girls, who had been kept away from the news but not away from the tension in the house, were doing something of their own. Amara had been quietly reconstructing the events of the hotel attack day by day from everything she'd seen and heard. Zuri, with her unnerving intuitive accuracy, had recognized one of the faces in a news photograph accompanying the corruption story, a man she had specifically seen on the rooftop that morning, not holding a rifle, but standing near the access door directing the other 2. Do-yeon's assistant. His name was in the caption, Young Soo-han, executive coordinator for Chairman Han Do-yeon. The girls didn't announce this discovery dramatically. Amara simply waited until Selene came to check on them and then showed her the photograph and the documented timeline she had constructed from memory, cross-referenced with news footage she'd found online. Selene looked at it. She looked at Amara. She took it downstairs. Min-jae went very still when he saw it. "She built this herself." "She notices things," Selene said. His jaw worked. "I need to reach out to Young Soo-han. That might be hard to do officially." Nyla, who had followed Selene downstairs because she refused to miss anything, said helpfully, "We could get him to talk." Min-jae looked at the 11-year-old. "Absolutely not." Nyla crossed her arms. "I was going to say through legal means." "Was absolutely not going to say through legal means," Zuri said from the doorway. Despite everything, Min-jae almost smiled. What happened in the next 48 hours was faster and stranger than any of them anticipated. Young Soo-han, it turned out, had his own reasons to be uncomfortable with where his loyalty had taken him. Do-yeon's plan had always been surgical: remove Min-jae, take control of the board, restructure. But it had involved a live assassination attempt in a public space, and that was a different category of crime from corporate maneuvering, and Soo-han had known that from the beginning and stayed silent anyway, and that silence had been eating at him for weeks. It required only the right pressure applied at the right moment to crack it open. Min-jae applied that pressure through his lawyers, quietly. With documented evidence of Soo-han's presence at the Aurora Palace that morning, evidence the police investigation had not yet connected publicly, the man requested a private meeting within 6 hours. The meeting lasted 4 hours. The recording of it lasted 4 hours. The board convened 2 days after that. Do-yeon arrived prepared to deliver a performance, calm, commanding, the kind of elegant authority that had kept him insulated from consequences for 2 decades. He had his talking points. He had his proxies in position. He had the financial documents ready to be presented as damning final evidence against his nephew. The elevator doors opened. Selene walked in first, with the girls behind her in a line. Amara held a folder. Nyla held her head at a specific angle that communicated enormous personal confidence. Zuri looked around the boardroom with her enormous dark eyes, and every single person at the table felt slightly seen through. Min-jae stood at the head of the room, jacket buttoned, hands behind his back, the stillness he always carried now carrying something different inside it. Not ice, but iron. Not cold, but settled. He played the recording. The room went from tense to silent in the first 3 minutes and stayed silent for another 40. Do-yeon's face cycled through several stages of calculation before settling into the specific blankness of a man watching something he cannot stop. 2 board members who had been on Do-yeon's side moved their chairs marginally. An observer might not have noticed. Min-jae noticed everything. The police came at the end of the recording. Not dramatically, just steadily, which was somehow worse. Do-yeon stood up and adjusted his cuffs and walked toward the door with his chin level. He had enough dignity left to refuse to run. "You built all of this on that family," he said to Min-jae as the officers reached him. His voice was measured, almost admiring, almost contemptuous. The mixture was impossible to read. "A nurse and 3 children." Min-jae looked at him without expression. "I didn't build anything on them. I finally learned how to build something worth keeping." Do-yeon was escorted out. The room exhaled. Several months later, the Itaewon Cafe had a new sign, Triplet Bloom Cafe, painted in warm gold lettering by someone who had clearly put serious thought into the font. Nyla had opinions about the font. The sign incorporated them partially. The interior had been expanded into the neighboring unit. Nothing unrecognizable, nothing stripped of its character, just more room for the music and the neighbors and the shoes by the door. The tables were still mismatched. The speaker on the windowsill still played whatever Selene felt like that morning. Min-jae had funded it. Not by taking over, but by stepping back and asking what they needed. It was, Selene had observed privately, the way he did most things now, with his hands open instead of braced. He was different in ways that were hard to articulate and impossible to miss. Less still, more present. He laughed sometimes now without the fractional delay that used to come before it, the pause where he'd checked whether laughing was appropriate. He argued with Nyla about everything, and somehow both of them enjoyed it. He'd learned how to make egusi soup well enough that Selene's neighbor, who'd been cooking it for 40 years, tasted it and gave him a look that meant she was unwilling to offer a compliment, but was not prepared to deny quality. The outdoor ceremony was small on purpose. A garden behind the cafe with string lights and wildflowers, and the neighboring families who had become, over the previous year, the specific kind of community that shows up when things are both hard and wonderful. No formal venue. No press, no performance. The girls wore matching yellow dresses and took their responsibilities as escorts with the seriousness of a military operation. Nyla walked on Selene's right side. Zuri walked on her left. Amara led. Selene wore her sister's earrings and a dress she had bought herself without telling anyone the significance of it, and she walked through the garden toward the man standing at the end of it with his hands clasped, and his brown eyes doing the thing she'd fallen for completely and irreversibly. Holding everything at once and giving all of it to her. He didn't cry during the vows. His jaw was very tight, and his eyes were extremely bright, and his hands gripped hers with a controlled pressure that communicated things the words didn't quite reach. Selene cried enough for both of them and was entirely comfortable with that arrangement. Afterward, when the food was out and the music was going and neighbors were spilling between the garden and the cafe, and Nyla had somehow convinced 3 different elderly guests to learn the same dance step, Min-jae found the girls at the edge of the lights. He crouched in front of them, all 3 at once. The way he'd learned was the only way to get a level conversation with people who had this much collective confidence. "I need to tell you something," he said. They waited. Amara with her steady eyes, Nyla with her arms folded, interested despite herself, Zuri already knowing if her expression meant anything, already knowing and letting him say it anyway. "That morning at the hotel," he said. His voice was quieter than usual. "I've thought about it a lot. What you did, what it cost you, what it started." He paused. "I'm not just talking about my life. I've had my life saved before. People who do things like that usually want something. Recognition, money, a story." He shook his head. "You 3 grabbed a stranger in the middle of a crowd because it was the right thing to do. You didn't ask what you'd get for it. You didn't wait for someone bigger to act. You just acted." Nyla looked like she was considering saying something. She chose not to. "This was a significant personal restraint, and they all knew it. That day you saved my life," he said. "But I think what you actually saved," he stopped. His throat moved. "Was the part of me that had forgotten there were still people like you in the world." He looked at all 3 of them. "So thank you for all of it, for being exactly who you are." Zuri stepped forward first and hugged him around the neck. Amara followed, quiet and certain. Nyla held out for exactly 3 more seconds, which was a record of restraint for her, and then pulled both of them and Min-jae into the kind of group embrace that doesn't leave room for dignity, and doesn't need to. Later that night, much later, when the guests were gone and the girls were finally asleep, and the cafe was quiet, Selene sat on the back step with her shoes off and her head on Min-jae's shoulder, and the string lights still glowing above the empty garden. She pressed her hand flat against her stomach. She'd known for 11 days. She'd been waiting for the right moment. She felt him look down at her. "Hey," she said quietly. She turned to look up at him. She didn't say anything. She just looked at him, and he looked at her, and then his face changed, the way it always changed when she showed him something true, opened all the way up, every guard down, every wall gone. He looked at her hand on her stomach, and then back at her face, and his eyes did the thing that was better than words. "Yeah," he said. His voice had no sound left in it. "Yeah," she said. He pulled her into him. She felt him exhale against the top of her head, long, slow, the exhale of a man who has been holding his breath for years and has finally decided he is allowed to let it go. Outside, Seoul kept its noise and its lights and its motion. The cafe sign rested in the quiet. The lanterns from the wedding still hung between the trees, swaying slightly in the night air. And inside the warmth of it all, the mismatched tables and the music-stained walls and the shoes piled by the door, a family that had been built from loss and courage and terrifying, improbable love slept together under one roof, whole.